Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Hi Michelle, an extraordinary week in politics.
It certainly has been, Caroline.
So the headlines have been dominated by the revelations that the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison had himself secretly appointed to 5 portfolios, including Finance, Treasury and Home Affairs. Now, some argue that what he did wasn't illegal and that no harm was done, and others say that his behaviour was an extraordinary breach of convention. What's your interpretation of his actions?
I think both are true. Certainly from what we know, it wasn't illegal, but it was decidedly eccentric and extraordinary, and I think it shows a lot about Scott Morrison's style, much of which we knew, but it just underlines how much he was anxious to have everything in his hands to potentially control areas that really normally would simply come under the remit of individual ministers. He didn't exercise that power except in one case, but he wanted to have it. And that's a very unusual way of operating, and also it shows that he liked secrecy more than transparency, and that again goes to wider questions of how he operated when he was PM.
So on Wednesday, Morrison gave a press conference. Did he adequately address the concerns about why he did it and why he did it secretly?
No, he didn't. Well, he addressed them, but not adequately. He essentially said he thought that the public and the opposition and everyone was saying he was responsible for everything, so he assumed responsibility or potential responsibility in many areas. And then on the question of why he didn't tell even his ministers or a number of the ministers who were directly affected by this, he said, well, I didn't want them to act any differently. He was arguing that it might have in some way, I guess, unnerved them. He didn't use that word, but it was a totally inadequate excuse. And to say that you couldn't confide in the cabinet really is saying, I don't trust my colleagues. And that is an extraordinary sort of position for a leader to believe.
So yeah, that's right, it goes to this big issue of trust. So how badly has it damaged the trust relationship with him and his colleagues?
Well, I think it's really swept away any regard for him among many colleagues. Of course, the relationships are different now. People such as Josh Frydenberg and Matthias Cormann, who are ministers whose portfolios he waded into, they're out of Parliament, one defeated, the other having got the OEC job well before, and other people that are still in Parliament are, I think, just angry and completely disillusioned with what happened. Karen Andrews, who was the Home Affairs Minister, another ministry that he went into, she called for him to resign from Parliament. She's now a Shadow Home Affairs Minister, so presumably hopes to have a political future, and can see the former Prime Minister really setting back the chances of the coalition effectively regrouping, and it's hard enough for it to do that anyway, let alone when it's being undermined by these revelations.
So should he resign?
Look, I think he should resign. It's not a clear-cut matter because he doesn't have a job to go to, and I think that's why he hasn't resigned. But also, it would cause a by-election in his seat of Cook. Liberals seem to think that would be held. It's a safe seat. But these days, of course, as we've seen from the election, no seat is absolutely safe, so there's a risk there. There's also the New South Wales election coming up, and it wouldn't be all that good a look to have a by-election where you had a bad swing. But the New South Wales government's got so many problems that would be probably pretty minor. But a by-election, of course, would cost quite a lot of money because they have to throw a lot of resources in to try and make sure that seat was held. So that's the political downside. But I do think that while Scott Morrison is in Parliament, he will continue to be a major irritant for the Liberals. And there's another book coming out soon by Nikki Sava. Now, she's a critic of Morrison. No doubt that'll have some revelations. It'll have another burst of publicity around it. It's really a no-win situation for the Libs while he's around.
Okay, so what about the role of the Governor-General, David Hurley? Now, he has borne the brunt of quite a bit of criticism this week about his approval of these appointments. Is the criticism justified, do you think?
I think David Hurley must have really wondered what hit him this week. Of course, he knew about the appointments because he was the one that formally made them, ticked off on them. But I think that the criticism is to a fair extent, not entirely, but to a fair extent misplaced. Firstly, it was the advice of the government, and the Governor-General should and does follow the advice of the government of the day, assuming it's, or knowing it's legal. Now, it hasn't really been seriously questioned that what was done was legal. So he was right in following that advice. But it's also part of the Governor-General's role to ask questions and to counsel. For example, to say, well, these are unusual appointments, or these will be made public, won't they? The Governor-General has defended himself by saying that he had no reason to think they wouldn't be made public, so he's obviously sensitive. So I think if there's criticism of the Governor-General, it's that he wasn't questioning enough from what we know. And he didn't say, well, are you sure you want to do this? I think he probably got the paperwork. Don't forget, Scott Morrison wasn't sworn in face-to-face. There wasn't a conversation. Paperwork came over and he thought, often ministers are sworn into portfolios. He didn't pick up on the difference between swearing ordinary ministers into a portfolio and the Prime Minister into these portfolios, and he just didn't think about the thing. So I think that is where he's open to criticism. On the other hand, you could say, would you really expect him to twig to this? So it depends how purist you are, I guess.
Okay, so there are calls for an inquiry into the matter. I mean, some commentators have suggested even a royal commission. Others, are talking about the matter being referred to the Privileges Committee. What do you think should happen, and what's likely to happen?
Well, certainly I think the government is exploring what it does, and a possible reference to the Privilege Committee, whether that was moved by the government or maybe the Greens or whatever. I think that is quite possible. In terms of an inquiry and talk of a royal commission, this is part of people saying there should be a royal commission into how COVID was handled. And I think that is right, but I think that should go to issues of, frankly, more substance than this, because we do need to know for future pandemics, if we have them, what went wrong with the management, how it could be done better in the future. I think in the case of Morrison's peculiar behaviour, that'll have its own self-correcting remedy, because no future Prime Minister will be going down this track. So I think when we get the Solicitor General's advice on the whole legality and so on surrounding this on Monday, that we'll really know enough about this. It's the more substantive questions about the management of COVID by the whole system, federal government, state governments, and the hospital system. That's really important to delve into for the future.
So are there any positives that have come out of this? Has this whole episode highlighted, weaknesses in the conventions?
Well, I think it's highlighted the fact that the system needs the conventions to operate, and in this case, a Prime Minister flouted the conventions. Now, maybe things should be made more transparent in terms of reporting to Parliament about the swearing in of ministers. Some people say that the House of Representatives practice, which sets out all these sorts of things, is already clear enough. Others say it needs to be a bit more explicit, but you're never going to be able to codify everything. You do have to rely on leaders understanding what the system requires in terms of proper behaviour and transparency. I don't think you can say you can have everything in writing. Things don't work like that.
But do we need to identify, though, why it fell down? Why is it that he didn't understand that? Is it just because of him and his particular character, or is there a wider systemic issue about the advice that he received from the public service or from his office? I mean, do we need to have a really, good granular look at what happened there?
I think we do understand why it fell down. It fell down by the fact that he was a particular sort of leader who wanted maximum control. I actually think that it begins and ends there.
Okay. Well, we'll find out, won't we, Michelle? There's plenty more to go, and we'll look forward to the advice on Monday. Thanks very much, Michelle.
Thanks, Caroline. Good to see you.